Inazo Nitobe Bushido, the soul of Japan, Bushido as an ethical system. Chivalry is a flower no less indigenous to the soil of Japan than its emblem, the cherry blossom. Nor is it a withered specimen of an antique virtue preserved in the herbarium of our history. It remains a living presence of power and beauty among us, and although it assumes no tangible shape or form, it nevertheless perfumes the moral atmosphere, making us aware that we remain under its potent spell. The conditions of society that brought it forth and nourished it have long vanished. Yet, as those far-off stars which once were and are not still continue to shed their rays upon us, so the light of chivalry, a child of feudalism, continues to illumine our moral path, surviving its parent institution. I take pleasure in reflecting upon this subject in the language of Burke, who pronounced that well-known touching eulogy over the neglected beer of its European prototype. George Miller could assert that chivalry, or any similar institution, never existed either among the peoples of antiquity or among the modern Orientals. Such ignorance, however, is largely excusable, since the third edition of the good doctor's work appeared in the very year that Commodore Perry was knocking at the portals of our exclusiveness. Some 10 years later, about the time that our feudalism lay in its death throes, Karl Marx, writing his Capital, drew his readers' attention to the peculiar advantage of studying the social and political institutions of feudalism, then to be seen in living form only in Japan. I would similarly invite the Western historical and ethical student to the study of chivalry as it exists in present-day Japan. Alluring as a historical disquisition on the comparison between European and Japanese feudalism and chivalry might be, it is not the purpose of this paper to enter upon it at length. My attempt is rather to relate, firstly, the origin and sources of our chivalry, secondly, its character and teaching, thirdly, its influence among the masses, and fourthly, the continuity and permanence of that influence. Of these several points, the first will be only brief and cursory. Otherwise, I should have to lead my readers into the devious paths of our national history. The second will be dwelt upon at greater length, as it is most likely to interest students of international ethics and comparative ethology in our modes of thought and action. The remainder will be treated as corollaries. The Japanese word which I have roughly rendered chivalry is, in the original, more expressive than horsemanship. Bu-shi-do means literally military, knight, ways, the ways which fighting nobles should observe in daily life as well as in their vocation. In a word, the precepts of knighthood, the noblesse oblige of the warrior class. Having thus given its literal significance, I may be permitted henceforth to employ the word in the original. The use of the native term is also advisable because a teaching so circumscribed and unique, engendering a cast of mind and character so peculiar and so local, must wear the badge of its singularity upon its face. Some words possess a national timbre so expressive of racial characteristics that the best translators can do them but scant justice, not to say positive injustice and grievance. Who can improve by translation what the German Gemuth signifies, or who does not perceive the difference between the two words, verbally so closely allied as the English gentleman and the French gentilhomme? Bushido, then, is the code of moral principles which the knights were required or taught to observe. It is not a written code. At most it comprises a few maxims handed down from mouth to mouth or issuing from the pen of some well-known warrior or savant. More commonly, it is an unuttered and unwritten code, possessing all the more the powerful sanction of veritable deed and of a law inscribed upon the fleshly tablets of the heart. It was founded neither on the creation of one brain, however able, nor on the life of a single personage, however renowned. It was an organic growth through decades and centuries of military career. It perhaps occupies in the history of ethics the same position that the English Constitution holds in political history. Yet it has had nothing comparable with the Magna Charta or the Habeas Corpus Act. True, early in the 17th century military statutes, Hado were promulgated. But their 13 brief articles were taken up chiefly with marriages, castles, leagues, etc., and touched, but scantily upon didactic regulations. We cannot, therefore, point to any definite time and place and say, here is its fountainhead. Only when it attains consciousness in the feudal age may its origin, in respect of time, be identified with feudalism. But feudalism itself is woven of many threads, and Bushido partakes of its intricate nature. As in England, the political institutions of feudalism may be said to date from the Norman conquest. So in Japan, we may say that its rise coincided with the ascendancy of Yoritomo, late in the 12th century. As, likewise in England, we find the social elements of feudalism far back in the period antecedent to William the Conqueror. So too the germs of feudalism in Japan had long existed before the epoch I have named. Again, in Japan as in Europe, when feudalism was formally established, the professional class of warriors naturally rose to prominence. These were known as samurai, meaning literally, like the Old English senet, necked, knight, guards, or attendants, resembling in character the soldiery whom Caesar mentioned as existing in Aquitania, or the comitati who, according to Tacitus, followed Germanic chiefs in his time. Or, to take a later parallel, the milits medii that one reads about in the history of medieval Europe. Asino, Japanese word, bu-kei or bushi, fighting knights, was likewise adopted into common use. They formed a privileged class, and must originally have been a rough stock who made fighting their vocation. This class was naturally recruited, during a long period of unceasing warfare, from the manliest and most adventurous. All the while the process of elimination proceeded, the timid and the feeble being sorted out, and only a rude race, all masculine with brutish strength, to borrow Emerson's phrase, surviving to establish families and the ranks of the samurai. Coming to profess great honor and great privileges, and correspondingly great responsibilities, they soon perceived the necessity of a common standard of behavior, especially as they were perpetually on a belligerent footing and belonged to different clans. Just as physicians limit competition among themselves by professional courtesy, just as lawyers sit in courts of honor when etiquette has been violated, so must warriors also possess some resort for final judgment upon their misdemeanors. Fair play in fight. What fertile germs of morality lie in this primitive sense, born of savagery and childhood? Is it not the very root of all military and civic virtues? We smile as if we had outgrown it, at the boyish desire of the small Briton, Tom Brown, to leave behind him the name of a fellow who never bullied a little boy or turned his back on a big one, and yet who does not know that this desire is the corner, stone upon which moral structures of mighty dimensions can be reared. May I not even go so far as to say that the gentlest and most peace-loving religions endorse this aspiration. This desire of Tom's is the basis upon which the greatness of England is largely built, and it will not take us long to discover that Bushido does not occupy a lesser pedestal. Had military interests operated alone, without higher moral support, how far short of chivalry would the ideal of knighthood have fallen? If fighting in itself, whether offensive or defensive, is, as Quakers rightly testify, brutal and wrong, we can still say with Lessing, we know from what failings our virtue springs. 3. Sneaks and cowards are epithets of the worst opprobrium to healthy, simple natures. Childhood begins life with these notions, and knighthood likewise. But as life expands and its relations become many-sided, the early faith seeks sanction from higher authority and more rational sources for its own justification, satisfaction, and development. In Europe, Christianity, interpreted with concessions convenient to chivalry, nevertheless infused it with spiritual data. Religion, war, and glory were the three souls of a perfect Christian knight, says Lamartine. In Japan, there were several sources of Bushido. Inazo Nitobe Bushido, the soul of Japan, Sources of Bushido, of which I may commence with Buddhism. It imparted a calm trust in fate, a quiet submission to the inevitable, that stoic composure in the presence of danger or calamity, that disdain of life and intimacy with death. For its method is contemplation, and its purport, so far as I apprehend it, is to be convinced of a principle that underlies all phenomena, and, if possible, of the absolute itself, and thus to put oneself in harmony with that absolute. Thus defined, the teaching becomes more than mere sectarian dogma, and whoever attains to the perception of the absolute lifts himself above mundane things and awakes to a new heaven and a new earth. What Buddhism failed to impart, Shintoism supplied in abundance. Such loyalty to the sovereign, such reverence for ancestral memory, and such filial piety as no other creed taught, were inculcated by Shinto doctrines, imparting passivity to the otherwise haughty character of the samurai. Shinto theology admits no place for the dogma of original sin. On the contrary, it affirms the innate goodness and God-like purity of the human soul, adoring it as the adytum from which divine oracles are proclaimed. All have observed that Shinto shrines are conspicuously void of objects and instruments of worship, and that a plain mirror hung in the sanctuary forms the essential part of their furnishing. The presence of this article is readily explained. It typifies the human heart, which, when perfectly placid and clear, reflects the very image of the deity. When one stands, therefore, before the shrine to worship, one sees his own image on the shining surface, and the act of worship becomes tantamount to the old Delphic injunction, know thyself. But self-knowledge does not imply, in either the Greek or Japanese teaching, knowledge of the physical part of man, not his anatomy or his psycho-physics. Knowledge was meant to be of a moral kind, the introspection of our moral nature. Mommsen, comparing the Greek and the Roman, observes that when the former worshipped, he raised his eyes to heaven, his prayer being contemplation, while the latter veiled his head, his being reflection. Essentially akin to the Roman conception of religion, our reflection emphasized not so much the moral as the national consciousness of the individual. Its nature, worship endeared the country to our inmost souls, while its ancestor, worship, tracing from lineage to lineage, made the imperial family the fountain head of the whole nation. To us, the country is more than land and soil from which to mine gold or to reap grain. It is the sacred abode of the gods, the spirits of our forefathers. To us, the emperor is more than the arch-constable of a Rechtsstaat, or even the patron of a Kulturstaat. He is the bodily representative of heaven on earth, combining in his person its power and its mercy. If what M. Boutme 5 says is true of English royalty, that it is not only the image of authority, but the author and symbol of national unity. As I believe it to be, doubly and trebly may this be affirmed of royalty in Japan. The tenets of Shintoism embrace the two predominating features of the emotional life of our race, patriotism and loyalty. Arthur Maynap very truly observes, in Hebrew literature it is often difficult to tell whether the writer is speaking of God or of the Commonwealth, of heaven or of Jerusalem, of the Messiah or of the nation itself. 6. A similar confusion may be noticed in the nomenclature of our national faith. I call it confusion because a logical intellect will so deem it on account of its verbal ambiguity. Still, being a framework of national instinct and race feelings, Shintoism never pretends to a systematic philosophy or a rational theology. This religion, or perhaps more correctly, the race emotions which this religion expressed, thoroughly imbued Bushido with loyalty to the sovereign and love of country. These acted more as impulses than as doctrines, for Shintoism, unlike the medieval Christian church, prescribed to its votaries scarcely any credenda, furnishing them at the same time with agenda of a straightforward and simple type. As regards strictly ethical doctrines, the teachings of Confucius were the most prolific source of Bushido. His enunciation of the 5 moral relations between master and servant, the governing and the governed, father and son, husband and wife, elder and younger brother, and between friend and friend, was but a confirmation of what the race instinct had recognized before his writings were introduced from China. The calm, benignant, and worldly, wise cast of his politico-ethical precepts was particularly well-suited to the samurai, who formed the ruling class. His aristocratic and conservative tone fitted well the requirements of these warrior statesmen. Next to Confucius, Mencius exercised immense authority over Bushido. His forcible and often distinctly democratic theories were exceedingly attractive to sympathetic natures, and they were even deemed dangerous to, and subversive of, the existing social order. Hence his works were long under censure. Still, the words of this master, mind found permanent lodgment in the heart of the samurai. The writings of Confucius and Mencius formed the principal text, books for youth, and the highest authority in discussion among the old. A mere acquaintance with the classics of these two sages was held, however, in no high esteem. A common proverb ridicules him who has only an intellectual knowledge of Confucius as a man ever studious but ignorant of analects. A typical samurai designates a literary savant a book, smelling sot. Another compares learning to an ill-smelling vegetable that must be boiled, and boiled ere it is fit for use. A man who has read a little smells somewhat pedantic, and a man who has read much smells still more so. Both are equally unpleasant. The writer thereby meant that knowledge becomes really such only when it is assimilated in the mind of the learner and manifests in his character. An intellectual specialist was regarded as a machine. Intellect itself was held subordinate to ethical emotion. Man and the universe were conceived alike to be spiritual and ethical. Bushido could not accept Huxley's judgment that the cosmic process was unmoral. Bushido made but light of knowledge as such. It was not pursued as an end in itself, but as a means to the attainment of wisdom. Hence he who stopped short of this end was regarded no higher than a convenient machine, which could turn out poems and maxims at bidding. Thus knowledge was conceived as identical with its practical application in life, and this Socratic doctrine found its greatest exponent in the Chinese philosopher Wan Yang Ming, who never wearies of repeating, "To know and to act are one and the same." I beg leave to make a moment's digression while on this subject, inasmuch as some of the noblest types of Bushi were strongly influenced by the teachings of this sage. Western readers will readily recognize in his writings many parallels to the New Testament. Making allowance for the terms peculiar to either teaching, the passage, "Seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things shall be added unto you," conveys a thought that one may find on almost any page of Wan Yang Ming. How strongly do these words resemble certain passages from Isaac Pennington or other philosophically mystics? I am inclined to think that the Japanese mind, as expressed in the simple tenets of the Shinto religion, was particularly receptive to Yang Ming's precepts. He carried his doctrine of the infallibility of conscience to extreme transcendentalism, attributing to it the faculty not only to perceive the distinction between right and wrong, but also to apprehend the nature of psychical facts and physical phenomena. He went as far as, if not further than, Berkeley and Fichte in idealism, denying the existence of things outside human ken. If his system possessed all the logical errors charged to solipsism, it nevertheless had the efficacy of strong conviction, and its moral import in developing individuality of character and equanimity of temper cannot be gainsaid. Thus, whatever the sources, the essential principles which Bushido imbibed from them and assimilated to itself were few and simple. Few and simple as these were, they sufficed to furnish a safe conduct of life, even through the most unsafe days of the most unsettled period of our nation's history. The wholesome, unsophisticated nature of our warrior ancestors derived ample sustenance for their spirit from a sheaf of commonplace and fragmentary teachings. gleaned, as it were, on the highways and byways of ancient thought, and stimulated by the demands of the age, fashioned from these gleanings anew a unique type of manhood. And this is why the 16th century displays in the highest degree the principal quality of the Japanese race, that great diversity which one finds there between minds, esprits, as well as between temperaments. While in India, and even in China, men seem to differ chiefly in degree of energy or intelligence, in Japan, they differ by originality of character as well. Now, individuality is the sign of superior races and of civilizations already developed. If we make use of an expression dear to Nietzsche, we might say that in Asia, to speak of humanity is to speak of its plains. In Japan, as in Europe, one represents it above all by its mountains. To the pervading characteristics of the men of whom M. de la Mazlière writes, let us now turn. I shall commence with rectitude or justice. Inazo Nitobe Bushido, the soul of Japan, rectitude or justice. The most essential precept in the code of the samurai. He loathes nothing more than underhand dealings and crooked undertakings. The idea of rectitude may be erroneous, it may be narrow. A well-known Bushi defines it as a power of resolution. Rectitude is the power of deciding upon a certain course of conduct in accordance with reason, without wavering, to die when it is right to die, to strike when to strike is right. Another describes it thus: rectitude is the bone that gives firmness and stature. As without bones the head cannot rest atop the spine, nor hands move nor feet stand, so without rectitude neither talent nor learning can make of a human frame a samurai. With it, lack of accomplishments is as nothing. Mencius names benevolence man's mind, and rectitude or righteousness his path. How lamentable, he exclaims, is it to neglect the path and not pursue it, to lose the mind and not know how to seek it again. When men's fowls and dogs are lost, they know to seek for them, but when they lose their mind, they do not know to seek for it. Have we not here, as in a glass darkly, a parable propounded 300 years later in another clime by a greater teacher, who called himself the way of righteousness, through whom the lost might be found. Yet I stray from my point. Righteousness, according to Mencius, is the straight and narrow path a man ought to take to regain the lost paradise. Even in the latter days of feudalism, when prolonged peace introduced leisure into the life of the warrior class, and with it dissipations of all kinds and gentle accomplishments, the epithet jishi, a man of rectitude, was held superior to any title denoting mastery of learning or art. The 47 faithfuls, of whom so much is made in our popular education, are commonly called the 47 jishi. In eras when cunning artifice could pass for military tact and downright falsehood for ruse de guerre, this manly virtue, frank and honest, shone like a jewel and was most highly praised. Rectitude is twin, brother to valor, another martial virtue. But before proceeding to speak of valor, let me linger a little on what I may term a derivation from rectitude, which, at first deviating slightly from its original, grew increasingly remote from it, until its meaning was perverted in popular acceptance. I speak of gi, rai, literally the right reason, which in time came to mean a vague sense of duty that public opinion expected an incumbent to fulfill. In its original and unalloyed sense, it meant duty, pure and simple. Hence we speak of the jiri we owe to parents, to superiors, to inferiors, to society at large, and so forth. In these instances, jiri is duty. For what else is duty than that which right reason demands and commands us to do? Ought not right reason to be our categorical imperative? Primarily, jiri meant no more than duty, and I dare say its etymology arose from the fact that in our conduct, say to our parents, though love should be the only motive, if it be lacking there must be some other authority to enforce filial piety, and they formulated this authority in jiri. Very rightly did they formulate this authority, jiri, since if love does not spring to deeds of virtue, Recourse must be had to man's intellect, and his reason must be quickened to convince him of the necessity of acting aright. The same holds for any other moral obligation. The instant duty becomes onerous. Right reason steps in to prevent our shirking it. Chivalry, thus understood, is a severe taskmaster, birch, rod in hand to compel sluggards to perform their part. It is a secondary power in ethics. As a motive, it is manifestly inferior to the Christian doctrine of love, which should be the law. I deem it a product of the conditions of an artificial society, one in which accident of birth and unmerited favor instituted class distinctions, in which the family was the social unit, in which seniority of age counted for more than superiority of talents, and in which natural affections often had to succumb before arbitrary man-made customs. Because of this very artificiality, Chivalry in time degenerated into a vague sense of propriety, summoned to explain this and to sanction that, as, for example, why a mother must, if need be, sacrifice all her other children in order to save the first born, or why a daughter must sell her chastity to procure funds to pay for the father's dissipation, and the like. Starting as right reason, Chivalry has, in my opinion, too often stooped to casuistry. It has even degenerated into a cowardly fear of censure. I might say of Chivalry what Scott wrote of patriotism, that, as it is the fairest, so it is often the most suspicious mask of other feelings. Carried beyond or below right reason, Chivalry became a monstrous misnomer. It harbored under its wings every sort of sophistry and hypocrisy. It might easily have been turned into a nest of cowardice, if Bushido had not possessed a keen and correct sense of courage, the spirit of daring and bearing. Inazo Nitobe Bushido, the soul of Japan, courage, the spirit of daring and bearing. To that consideration, we shall now return. Courage was scarcely considered a virtue, except when it was exercised in the cause of righteousness. In the Analects, Confucius defines courage by indicating, as is often his habit, what its negative consists in. Perceiving what is right, he remarks, and not doing it bespeaks lack of courage. Stated positively, the epigram runs, courage is doing what is right. To encounter all manner of hazards, to jeopardize oneself, to rush into the jaws of death, these are too often confounded with valor, and in the profession of arms such rashness of conduct, what Shakespeare calls valor misbegot, is unjustly applauded, but such applause finds no place in the precepts of knighthood. The distinction made in the West between moral and physical courage has long been recognized among us. What samurai youth has not heard of great valor and the valor of a villain? Valor, fortitude, bravery, fearlessness, courage, those qualities of soul which most readily captivate juvenile minds, and which may be disciplined by exercise and example, were, so to speak, the most popular virtues early imitated by the youth. Stories of military exploits were told almost before boys left their mother's breast. Does a little booby cry over any egg? The mother scolds him thus, "What a coward to lament a trifling pain! What will you do when your arm is hacked off in battle? What when you are summoned to commit harakiri?" We all know the pathetic fortitude of a famished little boy, Prince of Sendai, who, in the drama, is made to say to his little page, "Seest thou those tiny sparrows in the nest, how their yellow bills gape wide, and now see, there comes their mother with worms to feed them. How eagerly and gladly the little ones eat." But for a samurai, when his stomach is empty, it is a disgrace to feel hunger. Anecdotes of fortitude and bravery abound in nursery tales, though such stories are by no means the only method of early instilling the spirit with daring and fearlessness. Parents, with a sternness sometimes bordering on cruelty, set their children to tasks that drew forth every particle of pluck within them. Bears hurl their cubs down the gorge, they would say. Samurai sons were let down the steep valleys of hardship and urged on to Sisyphus, like tasks. Occasional deprivation of food or exposure to cold was regarded as a highly efficacious test for inuring them to endurance. Children of tender age were sent among utter strangers to deliver some message, were made to rise before the sun and before breakfast, attend to their reading exercises, walking to their teacher with bare feet in the cold of winter. They frequently, once or twice a month, as on the festival of the god of learning, assembled in small groups and passed the night without sleep, reading aloud by turns. Pilgrimages to all sorts of uncanny places, to execution grounds, to graveyards, to houses reputed to be haunted, were favorite pastimes of the young. In the days when decapitation was a public spectacle, not only were small boys sent to witness the ghastly scene, but they were made to visit alone the place in the darkness of night, and there to leave a mark of their visit on the trunkless head. Does this Spartan system of drilling the nerves strike the modern pedagogist with horror and misgiving whether the tendency would not brutalize, nipping in the bud the tender emotions of the heart? Let us examine what other conceptions Bushido entertained of valor. The spiritual aspect of valor is manifested by composure, a calm presence of mind. Tranquility is courage in repose. It is a statical manifestation of valor, as daring deeds are its dynamical expression. A truly brave man is ever serene. He is not taken by surprise. Nothing ruffles the equanimity of his spirit. In the heat of battle, he remains cool. Amid catastrophes, he keeps his mind level. Earthquakes do not shake him. He laughs at storms. We admire as truly great him who, in the menacing presence of danger or death, retains his self-possession. Who, for example, can compose a poem under impending peril or hum a strain in the very face of death. Such indulgence, betraying no tremor in the hand or in the voice, is taken as an infallible index of a large nature, of what we call a capacious mind, yoyu, which, far from being pressed or crowded, always has room for something more. There is even a sportive element in the courageous nature. Things serious to ordinary people may be, but play to the valiant. Hence, in old warfare, it was not unusual for the parties in a conflict to exchange repartee or to begin a rhetorical contest. Combat was not solely a matter of brute strength. It was, as well, an intellectual engagement. Of such a character was the battle fought on the bank of the Koromo River, late in the 11th century. The Eastern army routed, and its leader, Sadato, took to flight. When the pursuing general pressed him hard and cried aloud, "It is a disgrace for a warrior to show his back to the enemy," Sadato reined his horse. Upon this, the conquering chief shouted an impromptu verse, "Torn in shreds is the warp of the cloth, Koromo." Scarcely had the words left his lips when the defeated warrior, undismayed, completed the couplet. "Since age has worn its threads by use," Yashi, whose bow had all the while been bent, suddenly unstrung it and turned away, leaving his intended victim to do as he pleased. When asked the reason for his strange behavior, he replied that he could not bear to put to shame one who had kept his presence of mind while hotly pursued by his enemy. The sorrow which overtook Antony and Octavius at the death of Brutus has been the common experience of brave men. Kenshin, who had fought for 14 years with Shinjin, when he heard of the latter's death, wept aloud at the loss of the best of enemies. It was this same Kenshin who set a noble example for all time in his treatment of Shinjin, whose provinces lay in a mountainous region far from the sea, and who had consequently depended upon the Hojo provinces of the Takedo for salt. The Hojo prince, wishing to weaken him though not openly at war with him, had cut off from Shinjin all traffic in this important commodity. Nietzsche gave voice to the samurai heart when he wrote, "You are to be proud of your enemy. Then, the success of your enemy is your success also." Indeed, valor and honor alike required that we should recognize as enemies in war only those who prove worthy of being friends in peace. When valor attains this height, it becomes akin to benevolence, the feeling of distress. Inazo Nitobe Bushido, the soul of Japan, benevolence, the feeling of distress. Love, magnanimity, affection for others, sympathy and pity, qualities perpetually acknowledged as supreme virtues, the loftiest among the attributes of the human soul. Benevolence was regarded as a princely excellence in a double sense, princely among the many qualities of a noble heart, princely as peculiarly suited to a princely vocation. We required no aid from Shakespeare to feel, though, perhaps, like the rest of mankind, we required him to give it voice, that mercy became a sovereign better than his crown, that it presided above his sceptred dominion. How frequently both Confucius and Mencius reiterate that the foremost requisite of a ruler of men is benevolence. Confucius would declare, "Let but a prince cultivate virtue, people will flock to him. With people will come to him lands. Lands will bring forth for him wealth. Wealth will give him the benefit of right uses." Also, it is impossible that anyone should become ruler of the people to whom they have not yielded the subjection of their hearts. Both insisted on this indispensable condition in a ruler by proclaiming, "Benevolence, benevolence is man." Under the regime of feudalism, which might easily be twisted into militarism, it was to benevolence that we owed our rescue from despotism of the worst kind. An absolute surrender of life and limb by the governed would have left nothing for those who govern but self, will, and this has as its natural result the rise of that absolutism so often christened Oriental despotism, as if no despots existed in Occidental annals. Let it be far from me to advocate despotism of any kind, yet it is erroneous to confound feudalism with it. When Frederick the Great declared that kings are the first servants of the state, jurists rightly perceived that a new epoch in the evolution of liberty had dawned. Coinciding strangely in another quarter, in the remoter parts of western Japan, Yazen of Yanezawa uttered precisely the same sentiment, proving that feudalism was not sheer tyranny and oppression. A feudal prince, though he might be forgetful of reciprocal obligations to his vassals, entertained a loftier sense of duty to his ancestors and to heaven. He stood as a father to his people, whom heaven entrusted to his guardianship. In a sense not commonly attached to the word, Bushido accepted and confirmed paternal government, paternal too as contrasted with the less solicitous avuncular rule, Uncle Sam's, to wit. The old saying is not wholly untrue which nicknamed the King of England the King of Devils, because of his subjects, frequent uprisings against, and depositions of their princes, and which dubbed the French monarch the King of Asses, because of their endless taxes and levies, while bestowing the title of the King of Men upon the sovereign of Spain, because of his subjects' ready obedience. But enough. Virtue and absolute power may seem to the Anglo-Saxon mind terms impossible to reconcile. Pobyedonostsef has clearly laid out the contrast in the foundations of English and other European polities, namely, that these were organized upon the basis of common interest, while that one was marked by a highly developed individual personality. What this Russian statesman remarks of the personal dependence of individuals upon some social alliance and ultimately upon the ends of the state, among the continental nations of Europe, and particularly among Slavonic peoples, is doubly applicable to the Japanese. Hence, not only is the free exercise of monarchical authority felt less heavily by us than in Europe, but it is commonly tempered by parental consideration for the feelings of the people. Absolutism, says Bismarck, primarily demands in the ruler impartiality, honesty, devotion to duty, energy, and inward humility. If I may be permitted one more citation on the point, I will quote the German emperor at Koblenz, where he spoke of kingship, by the grace of God with its heavy duties, its tremendous responsibility to the Creator alone, from which no man, no minister, no parliament can release the monarch. We held benevolence to be a gentle virtue and mother-like. If upright rectitude and stern justice were especially masculine, mercy bore the softness and persuasive quality of a feminine nature. We were cautioned against indulging in indiscriminate charity, without seasoning it by justice and rectitude. Bushi no Nasake, the tenderness of a warrior, had a cadence that immediately appealed to whatever was noble in us. not because a samurai's mercy differed in kind from another's, but because it implied mercy where mercy was not a blind reflex, but where it observed due regard to justice, and where mercy did not remain merely a mood, but was supported by power to save or to slay. As economists distinguish demand as effectual or ineffectual, likewise we may term the mercy of Bushi effectual, since it involved the capacity to act for the benefit or injury of the recipient. Proud of their brute strength and privileges to employ it, the samurai fully accepted what Mencius taught concerning the potency of love. Benevolence, he states, brings under its sway whatever hinders its power, just as water subdues fire. They only doubt the power of water to quench flames who try to extinguish with a cupful a whole burning wagon, load of faggots. He further observes that the feeling of distress is the root of benevolence. Therefore, a benevolent man is ever mindful of those who are suffering and in distress. Thus did Mencius long anticipate Adam Smith, who bases his ethical philosophy upon sympathy. It is indeed remarkable how closely the knightly code of one land corresponds with that of others. In other words, how the much criticized Oriental moral notions find their counterparts in the noblest precepts of European letters. If the well-known lines, Hei tibi erunt arts, passisque imponer morm, parcere subjectis, et debellare superbos, were presented to a Japanese gentleman, he might readily accuse the Mantuan bard of borrowing from the literature of his own country. Benevolence toward the weak, the oppressed or the vanquished was constantly praised as especially fitting for a samurai. Admirers of Japanese art will be familiar with the depiction of a priest riding backward on an ox. The rider had once been a warrior who, in his day, made his name a byword of dread. In that dreadful engagement of Sumano, Ura, 1184 AD, one of the most decisive in our annals, he overtook an adversary and in single combat had him within the clutch of his gigantic arms. Now war etiquette demanded that, on such occasions, no blood should be spilled, unless the weaker party proved to be a man of rank or ability equal to his stronger captor. The grim combatant would have the name of the man beneath him, but the captive refusing to disclose it, his helmet was ruthlessly torn away, and the sight of a youthful face, smooth and beardless, made the astonished knight relax his grip. Assisting the youth to his feet, in paternal tones he bade the stripling go. "Off, young prince, to thy mother's side. The sword of Kumage shall never be tarnished by a drop of thy blood. Haste and flee o'er yon pass before thy enemies come in sight." The young warrior refused flight and implored Kumage, for the honor of them both, to dispatch him then and there. Above the hoary head of the veteran gleams the cold blade, which oft before has severed the cords of life, but his stout heart falters. There flashes across his mental vision the image of his own boy, who that very day marched to the sound of bugle to essay his maiden arms. The warrior's strong hand trembles. Once more he urges his victim to flee for his life. Finding all entreaties vain and hearing the approaching footsteps of his comrades, he cries, "If thou art overtaken, thou mayest fall at a more ignoble hand than mine. O thou infinite, receive his soul." In an instant the sword flashes through the air, and when it descends, it is red with adolescent blood. When the war is over, we find our soldier returning in triumph, but little he now cares for honor or fame. He renounces his martial course, shaves his head, assumes a priestly robe, devotes the remainder of his days to holy pilgrimage, never turning his face from the west, where lies the paradise whence salvation comes, and whither the sun hastens each day for his rest. Critics may detect weaknesses in this tale, which is casuistically open to attack. Let that be. Nevertheless, it shows that tenderness, pity, and love adorned even the most sanguinary deeds of the samurai. An old maxim among them ran that, "It becometh not the fowler to slay the bird which takes refuge in his bosom." This largely explains why the Red Cross movement, thought particularly Christian, so readily took root among us. For decades before the Geneva Convention reached our ears, Bacon, our greatest novelist, had acquainted us with the medical care of a fallen foe. In the Principality of Satsuma, famed for its martial spirit and education, the custom prevailed for young men to practice music, not the blare of trumpets or the beat of drums, those clamorous harbingers of blood and death, stirring us to imitate the actions of a tiger, but mournful and tender airs on the biwa, soothing our fiery natures, drawing our thoughts away from the scent of blood and the spectacle of carnage. Polybius tells of the constitution of Arcadia, which required all youths under 30 to practice music, so that gentle art might soften the harshness of that rugged region. To its influence, he ascribes the absence of cruelty in that portion of the Arcadian mountains. Nor was Satsuma unique in Japan in inculcating gentleness among the warrior class. It was ostensibly to express, but in truth to foster, these gentler emotions that the composing of verses was encouraged. Hence our poetry bears a strong undertow of pathos and tenderness. A familiar anecdote of a rustic samurai illustrates the point. His master, undeterred by the crude sentiment, persevered in encouraging the youth, until one day the music of his soul awoke to answer the sweet notes of the Yuguisu, and he wrote, "Stands the warrior, mailed and strong, to hear the Yuguisu's song, warbled sweet the trees among." We admire and enjoy the heroic incident in Kerner's short life, when, as he lay wounded on the field of battle, he scrawled his famous "Farewell to life." Incidents of a like kind were not uncommon in our warfare. Our terse, epigrammatic verses lent themselves particularly well to the improvisation of a single sentiment. Everyone of any education was either a poet or a rhymester. Not infrequently a marching soldier might be seen to halt, take his writing implements from his belt, and compose an ode, and such papers were afterward found in the helmets or the breast plates, when these were stripped from their lifeless wearers. What Christianity has accomplished in Europe in rousing compassion amid the horrors of war, love of music and letters has accomplished in Japan. The cultivation of tender feelings breeds a considerate regard for the sufferings of others. Modesty and complacence, moved by respect for others' feelings, are at the root of politeness. Inazo Nitobe Bushido, the soul of Japan, politeness. That civility and urbanity of deportment, which every foreign tourist has observed as a marked Japanese trait. Politeness is a poor virtue if it springs merely from a fear of offending good taste. It ought rather to be the outward manifestation of a sympathetic regard for the feelings of others. It likewise implies a due regard for the fitness of things, and therefore due respect to social positions. These latter express no plutocratic distinctions, but were originally distinctions founded on actual merit. At its loftiest, politeness nearly borders on love. We may reverently assert that politeness suffereth long, and is kind, envieth not, vaunteth not itself, is not puffed up, doth not behave itself unseemly, seeketh not her own, is not easily provoked, taketh not account of evil. Is it surprising that Professor Dean, when speaking of the 6 elements of humanity, assigns to politeness so high a position, inasmuch as it is the ripest fruit of social intercourse? While thus praising politeness, far be it from me to place it in the front rank of virtues. If we analyze it, we shall discover it correlated with other virtues of a higher order. For what virtue exists alone? While, or rather because, it was exalted as characteristic of the profession of arms, and as such esteemed beyond its deserts, the counterfeits of it came into existence. Confucius himself repeatedly taught that external appurtenances are as little a part of propriety as sounds are of music. When propriety was elevated to the sine qua non of social intercourse, it was only to be expected that an elaborate system of etiquette would come into vogue to train youth in correct social behavior. How one must bow in accosting others, how he must walk and sit, were taught and learned with the utmost care. Table manners grew into a science. Serving and drinking tea were elevated into a ceremony. A man of education is, of course, expected to master all these. Veblen, in his interesting book, called decorum a product and an exponent of the leisure class life. I have heard Europeans make slighting remarks upon our elaborate discipline of politeness. It has been criticized as absorbing too much of our thought, and therefore, in so far, as a folly to observe strict obedience to it. I admit there may be unnecessary niceties in ceremonious etiquette, but whether it partakes as much of folly as adherence to the ever-changing fashions of the West is, to my mind, not very clear. I do not regard fashions merely as freaks of vanity. On the contrary, I view them as a ceaseless search by the human mind for the beautiful. Far less do I consider elaborate ceremony altogether trivial. It denotes the result of long observation as to the most appropriate method of attaining a given end. If there is anything to be done, there is certainly a best way of doing it, and that best way is both most economical and most graceful. Spencer defines grace as the most economical manner of motion. The tea ceremony prescribes certain definite methods of manipulating a bowl, a spoon, a napkin, and so forth. To a novice it appears tedious, but one soon discovers that the prescribed method is, after all, the most saving of time and labor. In other words, the most economical use of force, hence, by Spencer's dictum, the most graceful. The spiritual significance of social decorum, or, to borrow from the vocabulary of the philosophy of clothes, the spiritual discipline of which etiquette and ceremony are but outward garments, is altogether out of proportion to what their appearance warrants us in believing. Spencer trace in our ceremonial institutions their origins and the moral motives that gave rise to them. But that is not what I shall endeavor to do in this book. It is the moral training involved in the strict observance of propriety that I wish to emphasize. I have said that etiquette was elaborated into the finest niceties, so much so that different schools, each advocating differing systems, came into existence. It means, in other words, that by constant exercise in correct manners one brings all the parts and faculties of his body into perfect order and into such harmony with itself and its environment as to manifest the mastery of spirit over the flesh. What new and deep significance the French word bienséance thus comes to contain. If the premise is true that gracefulness means economy of force, it follows logically that a constant practice of graceful deportment must bring with it a reserve, a storage of force. Fine manners, therefore, signify power and repose. When the barbarian Gauls, during the sack of Rome, burst into the assembled Senate and dared pull the beards of the venerable fathers, we deem the old gentlemen at fault, inasmuch as they lacked dignity and strength of manners. Is lofty spiritual attainment really attainable through etiquette? Why not? All roads lead to Rome. As an example of how the simplest thing can be fashioned into an art and then become spiritual culture, I may take Cha no Yu, the tea ceremony. Tea sipping is a fine art. Why should it not be? In the children drawing pictures on the sand, or in the savage carving on a rock, there lay the promise of a Raphael or a Michelangelo. How much more is the drinking of a beverage, which began with the transcendental contemplation of a Hindu anchorite, entitled to develop into a handmaid of religion and morality. That calmness of mind, that serenity of temper, that composure and quietness of demeanor, which are the first essentials of Cha no Yu, are without doubt the first conditions of right thinking and right feeling. The scrupulous cleanliness of the little room, shut off from sight and sound of the madding crowd, is in itself conducive to directing one's thoughts from the world. The bare interior does not engross one's attention, as do the innumerable pictures and brack of a Western parlor. The presence of kakamono calls our attention more to grace of design than to the beauty of color. The utmost refinement of taste is the object aimed at, whereas anything resembling display is banished with religious horror. The very fact that it was invented by a contemplative recluse, in a time when wars and the rumors of wars were incessant, is well calculated to show that this institution was more than a mere pastime. Before entering the quiet precincts of the tea room, the company assembling to partake of the ceremony laid aside, together with their swords, the ferocity of the battle, field, or the cares of government, there to find peace and friendship. Cha no yu is more than a ceremony. It is a fine art. It is poetry with articulate gestures for rhythm. It is a modus operandi of soul, discipline. Its greatest value lies in that last phase. Not infrequently, the other phases preponderated in the minds of its votaries, but that does not prove its essence was not spiritual in nature. Politeness will be a great acquisition if it does no more than impart grace to manners, but its function does not stop there. For propriety, springing as it does from motives of benevolence and modesty, and actuated by tender feelings toward the sensibilities of others, is always a graceful expression of sympathy. It requires that we weep with those who weep and rejoice with those who rejoice. You are out in the hot, glaring sun with no shade over you. A Japanese acquaintance passes by. You accost him, and instantly his hat is off. Well, that is perfectly natural. But the awfully funny performance is that all the while he talks with you, his parasol is down, and he stands in the glaring sun likewise. How foolish. Yes, exactly so, provided the motive were less than this. You are in the sun. I sympathize with you. I would willingly take you under my parasol were it large enough, or if we were familiarly acquainted. As I cannot shade you, I will share your discomforts. Little acts of this kind, equally or more amusing, are not mere gestures or conventionalities. They are the bodying forth of thoughtful feelings for the comfort of others. Another awfully funny custom is dictated by our canons of politeness. Yet many superficial writers on Japan have dismissed it simply by attributing it to the nation general topsy-turviness. Every foreigner who has observed it will confess the awkwardness he felt in making the proper reply on the occasion. In America, when you make a gift, you sing its praises to the recipient. In Japan, we depreciate or even slander it. The underlying idea with you is, this is a nice gift. If it were not nice, I would not dare give it to you, for it would be an insult to give you anything but what is nice. In contrast, our logic runs, you are a nice person and no gift is nice enough for you. You will not accept anything I can lay at your feet except as a token of my goodwill. So accept this, not for its intrinsic value, but as a token. It will be an insult to your worth to call the best gift good enough for you. Place the two ideas side by side, and we see that the ultimate idea is the same. Neither is awfully funny. The American speaks of the material which makes the gift. The Japanese speaks of the spirit that prompts the gift. It is perverse reasoning to conclude, because our sense of propriety shows itself in the smallest ramifications of our deportment, that one should take the least important of them, uphold it as the type, and pass judgment upon the whole principle. Which is more important, to eat or to observe rules of propriety about eating? A Chinese sage answers, if you take a case where the eating is all important, and the observing of rules of propriety is of little importance, and compare them together, why merely say that the eating is of more importance? Metal is heavier than feathers. But does that saying refer to a single clasp of metal and a wagon load of feathers? Take a piece of wood a foot thick and raise it above the pinnacle of a temple. None would call it taller than the temple. To the question, which is the more important, to tell the truth or to be polite? The Japanese are reported to give an answer diametrically opposite to what the American would say, but I forbear any comment until I come to speak of veracity or truthfulness. Inazo Nitobe Bushido, the soul of Japan, veracity or truthfulness, without which politeness is but a farce and a show. Propriety carried beyond right bounds, Masamune remarks, becomes a lie. An ancient poet surpasses even Polonius in the counsel he gives. To thyself be faithful. If in thy heart thou strayest not from truth, without prayer of then the gods will keep thee whole. the apotheosis of sincerity that Su Tzu sets forth in the doctrine of the mean, ascribes to it transcendental powers, almost confounding them with the divine. Sincerity is the origin and consummation of all things. Without sincerity, there would be nothing. He then expatiates eloquently on its far-reaching and long, enduring nature, on its power to effect changes without movement, and by its mere presence, to accomplish its purpose without effort. From the Chinese ideogram for sincerity, a compound of word and perfect, one is tempted to trace a parallel with the Neo-Platonic doctrine of logosta. Such heights the sage soars in his unwanted mystic flight. Lying or equivocation were regarded as equally cowardly. The Bushi held that his elevated social position demanded a loftier standard of veracity than those of tradesman or peasant. Bushi no Ikai, gone, the word of a samurai, or in exact German ein Ritterwort, served as sufficient guarantee of the truthfulness of an assertion. His word carried such weight that promises were commonly given and fulfilled without a written pledge, which would have been taken as quite beneath his dignity. Many thrilling anecdotes were related of those who atoned by death for nigh, gone, the double tongue. The regard for veracity was so high that, unlike the majority of Christians who persistently violate the plain commands of the teacher not to swear, the best samurai regarded an oath as derogatory to their honor. I am well aware that they sometimes swore by different deities or upon their swords, yet swearing never degenerated into wanton form or irreverent interjection. To emphasize their words, the practice of literally sealing them with blood was sometimes resorted to. For an explanation of such a practice, I need only refer my readers to Goethe's Faust. Piri 14 is partly right and partly wrong. Right in that an ordinary Japanese, even a samurai, may reply ascribed to him, but wrong in giving excessive weight to the term he renders falsehood. This word in Japanese yuzo serves to denote anything which is not truth, makoto, or fact, honto. Lowell tells us that Wordsworth could not distinguish between truth and fact, and in this respect, an ordinary Japanese is as good as Wordsworth. Ask a Japanese, or even an American of some refinement, to tell you whether he dislikes you or whether he feels ill at his stomach, and he will not hesitate long to tell falsehoods in answer. I like you much, or I am quite well, thank you. To sacrifice truth merely for the sake of politeness was regarded as an empty form, kaio, ray, and deception by sweet words, and was never vindicated. I own I am speaking now of the Bushido idea of veracity, but it may not be amiss to add a few words on our commercial integrity, of which I have heard much complaint in foreign books and journals. A loose business morality has indeed been the worst blot on our national reputation, but before abusing it or hastily condemning the whole race for it, let us calmly examine it, and we shall find consolation for the future. Of all the great occupations of life, none lay farther removed from the profession of arms than commerce. The merchant was placed lowest in the category of vocations the knight, the tiller of the soil, the mechanic, then the merchant. The samurai derived his income from land and could even indulge, if he chose, in amateur farming, but the counter and abacus were abhorred. We perceived the wisdom of this social arrangement. Montesquieu has made clear that debarring the nobility from mercantile pursuits was an admirable social policy, since it prevented wealth from accumulating in the hands of the powerful. The separation of power and riches kept the distribution of the latter more nearly equitable. Professor Dill, the author of Roman Society in the Last Century of the Western Empire, has reminded us that one cause of the decadence of the Roman Empire was the permission given to the nobility to engage in trade, and the consequent monopoly of wealth and power by a minority of senatorial families. Commerce, therefore, in feudal Japan, did not attain that degree of development which it would have reached under freer conditions. The obloquy attached to the calling naturally drew within its pale those who cared little for social repute. Call one a thief and he will steal. Stigmatize a calling and its followers will adjust their morals to it. For it is natural that the normal conscience, as Hugh Black says, rises to the demands made on it and easily falls to the limit of the standard expected from it. It is unnecessary to add that no business, commercial or otherwise, can be conducted without a code of morals. Our merchants of the feudal period possessed such a code among themselves, without which they could never have developed, as they did, such fundamental mercantile institutions as the guild, the bank, the bourse, insurance, checks, bills of exchange, etc. But in their dealings with people outside their vocation, the tradesmen lived too true to the reputation of their order. This being the case, when the country opened to foreign trade, only the most adventurous and unscrupulous rushed to the ports, while respectable business houses for some time declined the repeated requests of the authorities to open branch houses. Was Bushido powerless to arrest the current of commercial dishonor? Let us examine. Those well acquainted with our history will remember that only a few years after our treaty ports were opened to foreign trade, feudalism was abolished. And when with it the samurai's fiefs were taken and bonds issued in compensation, they were given liberty to invest these in mercantile transactions. Now you may ask, why could they not bring their much boasted veracity into their new business relations and so reform the old abuses? Those who had eyes to see could not weep enough. Those who had hearts to feel could not sympathize enough with the fate of many a noble and honest samurai who signally and irrevocably failed in his new and unfamiliar field of trade and industry through sheer lack of shrewdness in coping with his artful plebeian rival. When we know that 80% of business houses fail in so industrial a country as America, is it any wonder that scarcely one among 100 samurai who went into trade could succeed in his new vocation? It will be long before it is recognized how many fortunes were wrecked in the attempt to apply Bushido ethics to business methods. But it was soon patent to every observing mind that the ways of wealth were not the ways of honor. In what respects, then, did they differ? Of the three incentives to veracity that Lecky enumerates, viz., the industrial, the political, and the philosophical, the first was altogether lacking in Bushido. As for the second, it could develop but little in a political community under a feudal system. It is in its philosophical, and as Lecky says, in its highest aspect, that honesty attained elevated rank in our catalogue of virtues. With all my sincere regard for the high commercial integrity of the Anglo-Saxon race, when I ask for the ultimate ground, I am told that honesty is the best policy, that it pays to be honest. Is not this virtue, then, its own recompense? If it is followed because it brings in more gain than falsehood, I am afraid Bushido would rather indulge in lies. If Bushido rejects a doctrine of quid pro quo rewards, the shrewder tradesman will readily embrace it. Lecky has truly remarked that veracity owes its growth largely to commerce and manufacture. As Nietzsche puts it, honesty is the youngest of virtues. In other words, it is the foster child of industry, of modern industry. Without this mother, veracity resembled a blood orphan whom only the most cultivated mind could adopt and nourish. Such minds were general among the samurai, but for want of a more democratic and utilitarian foster, mother the tender child failed to thrive. With industries advancing, veracity will prove an easy, nay, a profitable virtue to practice. Just think, as late as November 1880, Bismarck sent a circular to the professional consuls of the German Empire, warning them of a lamentable lack of reliability with regard to German shipments inter alia, apparent both as to quality and quantity. Nowadays, we hear comparatively little of German carelessness and dishonesty in trade. In 20 years, the merchants learned that in the end, honesty pays. Already, our merchants are beginning to find that out. For the rest, I recommend the reader to two recent writers for well-weighed judgment on this point. 15. It is interesting to remark in this connection that integrity and honor were the surest guarantees, which even a merchant debtor could present in the form of promissory notes. it was quite usual to insert such clauses as these. In default of the repayment of the sum lent to me, I shall say nothing against being ridiculed in public. Or, in case I fail to pay you back, you may call me a fool, and the like. Often have I wondered whether the veracity of Bushido possessed any motive higher than courage. In the absence of any positive commandment against bearing false witness, lying was not condemned as a sin, but simply denounced as weakness, and as such, held highly dishonorable. As a matter of fact, the idea of honesty is so intimately blended, and its Latin and its German etymology so closely identified with honor. Inazo Nitobe Bushido, the soul of Japan, honor. That it is well that I should pause a little for the consideration of this particular feature of the precepts of knighthood. The sense of honor, implying a vivid consciousness of personal dignity and worth, could not fail to mark the samurai, bred and reared to prize the duties and privileges of their calling. A good name, one's reputation, the immortal portion of the self, that which survives the beastly, being taken for granted, any affront to its integrity was felt as shame, and the sense of shame, ren, kai, shin, was among the earliest virtues inculcated in juvenile education. You will be laughed at, it will disgrace you, are you not ashamed? Were the final appeals employed to correct the conduct of a wayward youth. Such an appeal to his honor touched the most tender chord in the child's heart, as if it had been suckled on honor in the mother's womb. For truly honor is a prenatal influence, closely bound up with intense family consciousness. In losing the solidarity of families, says Balzac, society has lost the fundamental force which Montesquieu named honor. Indeed, the sense of shame seems to me the earliest indication of our race's moral consciousness. The first and severest penalty which befell humanity after tasting the fruit of that forbidden tree was, in my judgment, not the sorrow of childbirth, nor the thorns and thistles, but the awakening of shame. Few scenes in history surpass in pathos that of the first mother, heaving at the breast and with trembling fingers, her crude needle upon the few fig leaves which her dejected husband had plucked for her. This first fruit of disobedience clings to us with a tenacity like no other. All the sartorial ingenuity of mankind has still not succeeded in stitching an apron that will effectively conceal our sense of shame. The dread of disgrace was so great that, although our literature lacks the eloquence with which Shakespeare gives voice to Norfolk, the threat nevertheless hovered like Damocles, soared above every samurai, and frequently took on a morbid aspect. In the name of honor, acts were committed which no code of Bushido can justify. At the slightest, nay, imaginary affront, the quick-tempered braggart took offense, drew his sword, and needless quarrels arose, and many an innocent life was lost. The tale of a benevolent citizen who pointed out to a bushi a flea leaping on his back, and who was immediately cut in two, on the dubious ground that since fleas are parasites feeding on animals, it was an unpardonable insult to liken a noble warrior to a beast. I say, such stories are too frivolous for belief. Yet the circulation of such tales implies three things. 1, that they were invented to intimidate the common people. 2, that abuses were actually made of the samurai's profession of honor. And 3, that a very strong sense of shame existed among them. It is plainly unjust to take an abnormal case to cast aspersions upon the precepts, any more than to judge the true teaching of Christ by the fruits of religious fanaticism and extravagance, inquisitions and hypocrisy. But as in religious monomania, there is something touchingly noble when compared with the delirium tremens of a drunkard. So in that excessive sensitiveness of the samurai about their honor, do we not discern the groundwork of a genuine virtue? The morbid excess toward which the delicate code of honor inclined was strongly offset by exhortations to magnanimity and patience. To take offense at slight provocation was derided as short-tempered. The common proverb ran, "To bear what you think you cannot bear is really to bear." The great Ieyasu bequeathed to posterity a few maxims, among them these: the life of man is like traveling a long way with a heavy load upon the shoulders. Haste not, reproach none, but be forever watchful of thine own shortcomings. Forbearance is the foundation of long days. He exemplified in his life what he counseled. A literary wit placed a characteristic epigram in the mouths of three famous personages in our history. To Nobunaga he ascribed, "I will kill her if the nightingale sings not in time." To Hideyoshi, "I will force her to sing for me." And to Ieyasu, "I will wait till she opens her lips." Patience and long suffering were likewise highly commended by Mencius. In one place he writes to this effect, "Though you strip yourself and insult me, what is that to me? You cannot defile my soul by your outrage." Elsewhere he teaches that anger at a trivial offense is unworthy of the superior man, but indignation for a great cause is righteous wrath. To what pitch of unmartial and unresisting meekness Bushido could carry some of its devotees may be observed in their utterances. Take, for instance, this saying of Agawa, "When others speak all manner of evil things against thee, return not evil for evil, but rather reflect that thou wast not more faithful in the discharge of thy duties." Take another from Kumazawa, "When others blame thee, blame them not. When others are angry at thee, return not anger. Joy cometh only as passion and desire part." Still another instance I may cite from Sego, upon whose overhanging brows shame is ashamed to sit. "The way is the way of heaven and earth. Man's place is to follow it. Therefore make it the object of thy life to reverence heaven. Heaven loves me and others with equal love. Therefore with the love wherewith thou lovest thyself, love others. Make not man thy partner but heaven, and making heaven thy partner do thy best. Never condemn others, but see to it that thou comest not short of thine own mark." Some of those sayings call to mind Christian expostulations and show how near, in practical morality, natural religion can approach the revealed. Not only did these sayings remain as words, but they were actually embodied in deeds. It must be confessed that very few reached this lofty altitude of magnanimity, patience, and forgiveness. It was greatly to be regretted that nothing clear and general was laid down as to what constitutes honor, only a few enlightened minds perceiving that it, from no condition rises, but that it consists in each man doing well his part. For nothing was easier than for youths, in the heat of action, to forget what Mencius had taught them in their quieter hours. Said this sage, "'Tis in every man's mind to love honor, but little doth he dream that what is truly honorable lies within himself and not anywhere else. The honor which men confer is not good honor. Those whom Kao the Great ennobles, he can make mean again. For the most part, an insult was speedily resented and avenged by death, as we shall see hereafter, while honor, too often merely vain glory or worldly approbation, was esteemed the summum bonum of earthly existence. Fame, and not wealth or learning, was the mark toward which youths were urged to strive. Many a lad vowed within himself, as he crossed the threshold of his paternal dwelling, that he would not return until he had made a name in the world. And many an ambitious mother refused to see her sons again unless they could return home, as the phrase has it, caparisoned in brocade. To avoid shame or to win a name, samurai boys would submit to any privations and endure the severest ordeals of body and mind. They knew that honor won in youth ripens with age. In the memorable siege of Osaka, a young son of Ieyasu, despite his earnest entreaties to be placed in the vanguard, was set at the rear of the army. When the castle fell, he was so chafed and wept so bitterly that an old counselor endeavored to console him with every resource at his command. "Take comfort, sire," said he, "in the thought of the long future before you. In the many years that you may live, there will come divers occasions to distinguish yourself." The boy fixed an indignant gaze upon the man and said, "How foolishly you talk. Can ever my 14th year come round again? Life itself was held cheap if by its exchange honor and fame could be secured. Hence, whenever a cause presented itself esteemed dearer than life, With the utmost serenity and rapidity was life surrendered. Of the causes in comparison with which no life was too dear to sacrifice was the duty of loyalty. Inazo Nitobe Bushido, the soul of Japan, the duty of loyalty, which formed the keystone by which the feudal virtues were set into a symmetrical arch. Other virtues feudal morality shares with other ethical systems, with other ranks of men, but this one, homage and fealty to a superior, is its peculiar characteristic. I admit that personal fidelity is a moral adhesion existing among all sorts and conditions of many band of pickpockets owe allegiance to a fagin. Yet it is solely within the code of chivalrous honor that loyalty attains supreme significance. Despite Hegel's strictures that the fidelity of feudal vassals, being an obligation to an individual and not to a commonwealth, rests upon wholly unjust principles. 16. A great contemporary of his took pride in asserting that personal loyalty was a German virtue. Bismarck had ample reason for his boast, not because the true he praised was the exclusive possession of his fatherland or of any single people, but because this cherished fruit of chivalry lingers longest where feudalism has endured the most. In America, where everybody is as good as anybody else, and, as the Irishman added, better too, such exalted notions of loyalty as we entertain toward our sovereign may be called excellent within certain bounds, but absurd if propagated among us. Montesquieu observed long ago that what is right on one side of the Pyrenees is wrong on the other, and the recent Dreyfus trial confirmed his remark's truth, except that the Pyrenees were not the sole frontier beyond which French justice finds no harmony. Likewise, loyalty as we understand it may win few adherents elsewhere, not because our conception is erroneous, but partly because it is, I fear, neglected, and partly because we practice it to a degree unmatched in other lands. Griffiths 17 was correct in noting that whereas Confucian ethics in China made obedience to parents the chief human duty, in Japan precedence was accorded to loyalty. At the hazard of startling some of my better readers, I will recount of one who could endure to follow a fallen lord, and who thus, as Shakespeare avers, earned a place I the story. The tale concerns one of the purest figures in our annals, Michizane, who, falling victim to envy and slander, is banished from the capital. Not content with this stroke, his remorseless foes now aim at the annihilation of his line. A diligent search for his son, not yet of full growth, uncovers the fact of his concealment in a village school kept by one Genzo, a former retainer of Michizane. When commands are sent to the schoolmaster to deliver the head of the youthful offender on a certain day, his first thought is to contrive a fitting substitute. He studies his school, roll, examines with vigilant eyes all the boys as they file into the class, room, but none of the children born of the soil bears any likeness to his master's son. His despair, however, is brief, for lo, a new scholar is announced, a handsome boy of the same age as his master's child, accompanied by a mother of noble bearing. No less keenly aware of the resemblance between infant lord and infant retainer were the mother and the boy himself. In domestic privacy, both had offered themselves upon the altar, she her life, he his heart, yet without sign to the outer world. Unconscious of what had passed between them, it is the teacher who proposes the expedient. Here, then, is the scapegoat. The remainder of the narrative may be shortly told. On the appointed day, there comes the officer charged to identify and receive the head of the youth. Will he be deceived by the counterfeit head? The poor Genzo's hand rests upon the hilt of his sword, ready to strike either at the man or at himself, should the inspection frustrate his plan. The officer lifts the grisly object before him, surveys each feature with composure, and in a deliberate, business-like tone, pronounces it genuine. That evening in a solitary house waits the mother we saw at the school. Does she know the fate of her child? It is not for his return, that she watches anxiously for the opening of the wicket. Her father, in-law, has long been a recipient of Michizane's benefactions, but since his exile necessity has compelled her husband to enter the service of the enemy of his family's benefactor. He himself could not prove false to his own cruel master, but his son could serve the cause of the grandsire's lord. As one familiar with the exile's household, it was he who had been charged with the task of identifying the boy's head. But this child was a conscious and willing victim. It is a tale of vicarious death, as momentous as, and no more revolting than, the account of Abraham's intended sacrifice of Isaac. In both instances, it was obedience to the summons of duty, utter submission to the command of a higher voice, whether uttered by a visible or invisible angel, or heard by an outward or an inward ear. But I refrain from sermonizing. Western individualism, which recognizes distinct interests for father and son, husband and wife, inevitably stresses the duties owed by one to the other. But Bushido held that the interest of the family and of its members is one and indivisible. This interest it linked with affection natural, instinctive, irresistible. Hence, if we die for one we love with natural love, which animals themselves possess, what then? For if ye love them that love you, what reward have ye? Do not even the publicans the same? In his great chronicle, Sanyo describes with moving language the inward conflict of Shijimori over his father's rebellious deeds. If I be loyal, my father must be undone. If I obey my father, my duty to my sovereign must go amiss. Poor Shijimori. We behold him thereafter praying with all his soul that kind heaven would visit him with death, that he might be released from this world where purity and righteousness find no ease. Many a Shijimori has his heart torn between duty and affection. Indeed, neither Shakespeare nor the Old Testament itself renders our notion of filial piety adequately, and yet in such struggles Bushido never faltered in its preference for loyalty. Women, likewise, urged their offspring to relinquish all for the king. Ever as firm as Widow Windham and her illustrious consort, the samurai matron stood prepared to surrender her boys for the sake of loyalty. Since Bushido, like Aristotle and certain modern sociologists, regarded the state as preceding the individual, the latter being born into the former as an integral part thereof, he must live and die for it or for the rightful holder of its authority. Readers of Crito will recollect the plea by which Socrates makes the city's laws entreat him concerning his escape. Among other things, he causes them to say, "Since you were begotten and nurtured and educated under us, dare you once to say you are not our offspring and servant, you and your fathers before you?" These words do not strike us as extraordinary, for the same idea has long been on the lips of Bushido, with this distinction, that the laws and the state were personified in our thought. Loyalty is an ethical consequence of this political theory. Spencer's view that political obedience, loyalty, serves only a transitional purpose, 18 it may be so. Sufficient unto the day is the virtue thereof. Spencer foretells, will give place to loyalty to the dictates of conscience. Suppose his inference comes true, will loyalty and its attendant instinct of reverence vanish forever? We shift our allegiance from one master to another, without proving faithless to either. From subjects of a ruler who wields the temporal scepter, we become servants of the sovereign who sits enthroned in the penetralia of our heart. Some years ago, a very foolish controversy, roused by the misled disciples of Spencer, made havoc among Japan's reading public. In their zeal to maintain the throne's claim to undivided loyalty, they accused Christians of treasonable tendencies because they profess fidelity to their Lord and Master. They brought forth sophistical arguments without the cunning of sophists, and scholastic tortuosities minus the subtleties of the schoolmen. Little did they grasp that we can, in a sense, serve two masters without holding to the one or despising the other, rendering unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's. Did not Socrates, even as he steadfastly refused to grant one iota of loyalty to his demon, obey with equal fidelity and composure the mandate of his earthly master, the state. His conscience he followed while living, his country he served in death. Alack the day when a state grows so mighty as to demand of its citizens the commands of their conscience. Bushido did not require that we make our conscience the slave of any lord or king. Thomas Mowbray voiced our sentiment truly when he declared, "Myself I throw, dread sovereign, at thy foot. My life thou shalt command, but not my shame. The one my duty owes, but my fair name, despite of death, that lives upon my grave, to dark dishonor's use, thou shalt not have." A man who sacrificed his own conscience to the caprice or freak or fancy of a sovereign was rated low by the precepts. Such a person was despised as Ni, Shin, a cringing sycophant, who courts favor by unscrupulous fawning, or as Cho Shin, a favorite who wins his master's affection by servile compliance. These two species of subjects correspond exactly to those which Iago depicts: the one, a dutiful and knee-bowing knave, fond of his own obsequious bondage, wasting his time much like his master's ass; the other decked in forms and visages of duty, yet keeping his heart intent upon himself. When a subject dissented from his master, the loyal course for him was to employ every available means to persuade him of error, as Kent did to King Lear. Failing in this, let the master deal with him as he pleases. In such cases, it was quite customary for the samurai to make a final appeal to the understanding and conscience of his lord, by proving the sincerity of his words with the shedding of his own blood. Life being regarded as the means whereby to serve one's master, and its ideal being set upon honor, the whole education and training of a samurai. Inazo Nitobe Bushido, the soul of Japan, were thus conducted. The first lesson in knightly pedagogics was to mold character, putting in the shade the subtler faculties of prudence, intelligence, and dialectics. We have seen the significant role that aesthetic accomplishments played in his education. Indispensable to a man of culture as they were, they remained accessories rather than essentials of samurai training. Intellectual superiority was, of course, esteemed, yet the word kai, used to denote intellectuality, primarily signified wisdom and relegated knowledge to a very subordinate rank. The tripod said to sustain the framework of Bushido was kai, jin, yu, wisdom, benevolence, and courage, respectively. In essence, a samurai was a man of action. Science lay outside the pale of his activity. He availed himself of it only in so far as it concerned his profession of arms. Religion and theology were relegated to the priests. He concerned himself with them only in so far as they nourished courage. Like an English poet, the samurai held that "'tis not the creed that saves the man, but it is the man that justifies the creed." Philosophy and literature composed the chief part of his intellectual training. Yet even in pursuing these, it was not objective truth he chiefly sought. Literature was followed largely as a pastime, and philosophy as a practical instrument in forming character, if not for the elucidation of some military or political question. From what has been said, it will not be surprising to note that the curriculum of studies, according to the pedagogics of Bushido, consisted chiefly of the following: fencing, archery, jiu-jitsu or yawara, horsemanship, the spear, tactics, calligraphy, ethics, literature, and history. Of these, jiu-jitsu and calligraphy demand a few words of explanation. Great stress was laid upon good writing, probably because our logograms, partaking as they do of the nature of pictures, possess artistic value, and because chirography was accepted as indicative of one's personal character. Jiu-jitsu may be briefly defined as the application of anatomical knowledge to the purposes of offense or defense. It differs from wrestling in that it does not depend upon mere muscular strength. It differs from other forms of attack inasmuch as it employs no weapon. Its feat consists in clutching or striking such parts of the enemy's body as will render him numb and incapable of resistance. Its object is not to kill, but to incapacitate the adversary for action for the time being. A subject of study one would expect in military education, and which is rather conspicuous by its absence in the Bushido course, is mathematics. This, however, may be readily explained in part by the fact that feudal warfare was not conducted with scientific precision. Not only so, but the whole training of the samurai was unfavorable to fostering numerical notions. Chivalry is uneconomical. It even boasts of penury. It declares with Ventidius that ambition, the soldier's virtue, rather makes choice of loss than gain which darkens him. Don Quixote takes more pride in his rusty spear and skin, and bone horse than in gold and lands, and the samurai is in hearty sympathy with his exaggerated confer of La Mancha. He scorns money itself, the art of making or hoarding it. To him, it is veritably filthy lucre. The hackneyed expression to describe the decadence of an age runs, that the civilians loved money and the soldiers feared death. Niggardliness in gold and in life excites as much disapprobation as their lavish use is panegyrized. A current precept runs, less than all things, men must grudge money. It is by riches that wisdom is hindered. Hence children were trained with utter disregard for economy. It was considered bad taste to speak of it, and ignorance of the value of different coins was taken as a token of good breeding. Knowledge of numbers was indispensable in the mustering of forces, as well as in the distribution of benefices and fiefs, but the counting of money was left to meaner hands. In many feudatories, public finance was administered by a lower sort of samurai, or by priests. Every thinking Bushi knew well enough that money formed the sinews of war, yet he did not think of elevating the appreciation of money into a virtue. It is true that thrift was enjoined by Bushido, but not for economical reasons so much as for the training of abstinence. Luxury was deemed the greatest menace to manhood, and the severest simplicity was required of the warrior class, sumptuary laws being enforced in many clans. We read that in ancient Rome the farmers of revenue and other financial agents were gradually raised to the rank of knights, the state thus showing its appreciation of their service and of the importance of money itself. How closely this was connected with the luxury and avarice of the Romans may be readily imagined. Not so was the case with the precepts of knighthood. These persisted in systematically regarding finance as something low, that is, as compared with moral and intellectual vocations. Money and the love of it being thus diligently ignored, Bushido itself could for long remain free from 1,001 evils of which money is the root. This suffices to explain why our public men have long been relatively free from corruption. But alas, how fast plutocracy is making its way in our time and generation. The mental discipline, which nowadays would chiefly be aided by the study of mathematics, was supplied by literary exegesis and deontological discussions. Very few abstract subjects troubled the minds of the young. The chief aim of their education was, as I have said, decision of character. Those whose minds were merely stored with information found no great admirers. Of the three services of studies that Bacon gives for delight, ornament, and ability, Bushido showed a decided preference for the last, where their use is in judgment and the disposition of business. Whether it was for the disposition of public business or for the exercise of self-control, education was conducted with a practical end in view. Learning without thought, said Confucius, is labor lost. Thought without learning is perilous. When character and not intelligence, when the soul and not the head, is selected by a teacher as the material to work upon and to develop, his vocation partakes of a sacred character. It is the parent who has born me. It is the teacher who makes me man. With this idea, therefore, the esteem in which one's preceptor was held ran very high. A man who would evoke such confidence and respect from the young must necessarily be endowed with superior personality without lacking erudition. He was a father to the fatherless and an advisor to the erring. Thy father and thy mother, so runs our modest maxim, are like heaven and earth. Thy teacher and thy lord are like the sun and moon. The present system of paying for every sort of service was not in vogue among adherents of Bushido. It believed in a service that can be rendered only without money and without price. Spiritual service, be it that of priest or teacher, was not to be repaid in gold or silver, not because it was valueless, but because it was invaluable. Here the non-arithmetical honor instinct of Bushido taught a truer lesson than modern political economy. For wages and salaries can be paid only for services whose results are definite, tangible, and measurable, whereas the best service done in education, namely soul development, and this includes the services of a pastor, is not definite, tangible, or measurable. Being immeasurable, money, the ostensible measure of value, proves of inadequate use. Usage sanctioned that pupils bring to their teachers money or goods at different seasons of the year. But these were not payments but offerings, which indeed were welcome to the recipients, who were usually men of stern caliber, boasting of honorable penury, too dignified to work with their hands and too proud to beg. They were grave personifications of high spirits, undaunted by adversity. They embodied what was considered as the end of all learning, and were thus a living example of that discipline of disciplines, self-control.